On this week's edition of the Palace of Pistons podcast, what are our favorite and the least favorite moves that the Pistons made this summer? And also, should we feel bad for Cade Cunningham? We'll talk about all that and more on this week's edition of the Palace of Pistons podcast, brought to you by Believe. Let's get it.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another exciting night of NBA basketball.
The Pistons are digging in. They got the depth. They got the big men. They got the better basketball team. No doubt about it.
Pistons need a three, and they have just under 3 seconds to do it. Here's Chauncey Billups. Here it is. He's got it. He's got it. Chauncey Billups hits the three. Overtime. Amazing.
Out of bounds. Detroit basketball.
Pistons fans, welcome back to another edition of the Palace Pistons podcast, part of the Believe Network. I'm your host, back off of a hiatus, Mike Anguilano. Joining me this week is Aaron Johnson. Aaron, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm good. We are struggling for stuff to talk about in the offseason, but we're going to continue to put on a good show every single week because that's what we do here. So ready to get into everything with you.
That's exactly what we do. We are scraping the barrel. It's a little bit quiet now with the Olympics going on. It's quiet in terms of Pistons news, that is, but we do have some nice topics to talk about today. And before we get into them, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, and that is BetOnline. And BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform, and it's your number one source for everything online sports betting. Right now, you can receive a 50% free bet of up to $250 on your first deposit to bet on anything from the Olympics to baseball to Formula One. BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. And when the game is over, you can head on over to the online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of over 150 slots games. Head on over to the website today to get in on the action. Use our promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for a 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250. Again, that's a BLEAV for a 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250 when you use BetOnline. BetOnline, the game starts here. I'd like to also take a moment to plug our Substack, the Palace Pistons Substack, which is your number one source for all of your Pistons news. We will have the Monday weekly drive dropping from yours truly, a Wednesday article dropping from Aaron. Every single week, even when there's nothing to write about, we still find a way to get some content out. And every Friday or sometimes Thursday is the Palace Pistons podcast right to your inbox. You just have to subscribe to our newsletter via Substack. And of course, you can find that in the show notes if you're watching on YouTube. You can find that in the description if you're listening to on any of the numerous podcasting apps. It really means a lot to us if you would subscribe. You get this content again right to your inbox. No questions asked. Don't have to look anything up. Don't have to hunt around for the YouTube video. It's right in your email. So please do subscribe. It really does mean a lot to us. Aaron, we really have been scraping the bottom of the barrel for content. We're going to keep doing that. That doesn't mean we don't have great things to talk about. The offseason is also still happening, but it may be a little premature. I'm sure that we'll get this pod out and the Pistons will make an enormous trade. But so far, the offseason is at a point where I think we can examine some of the moves that have happened, some of our favorite moves, some of our least favorite moves. The Pistons made a lot of moves. They added a lot of NBA level talent, as we've talked about for several weeks now at this point. But if you were to pinpoint your favorite move of the offseason so far, what would be like your number one transaction the Pistons made this offseason?
I'm going to go all the way back to Trajan Langdon's, one of his first moves as the team's president of basketball operations. And I'm going to go to the Tim Hardaway Jr. trade. You bring in something that the Pistons have needed with this current core that they've assembled. And it was really laying the foundation for what this entire offseason was going to look like under Langdon in year one. The Pistons added shooting and added assets in a very friendly deal. I know people were very upset about giving up Quentin Grimes, who could not get on the court for the Pistons last year and wasn't a happy camper while in Detroit. But in return, they got a veteran microwave scorer, spacing the floor, has had ties to the city, has been, linked to this team since he was with the Knicks. Like, it was mere destiny for Tim Hardaway Jr. to eventually become a Detroit Piston. And that was one of the first things that Trajan Langdon took care of once coming aboard. I just really liked the move. And it's not even about just that move in singularity, but it gave us, in hindsight, a look at how Langdon was going to operate throughout the coming months, how he was going to build out this roster, how he took seriously the need to get more wings, to get more shooting, to get veterans that can play, while also working to fill up the cupboard with some additional assets. I know the second-round draft picks aren't blue-chip level assets, but they matter. They matter when you want to spend 3-4 second-round picks to move up for a guy in the 20s in the first round of a draft. Like, those are the kind of around-the-needle moves that good executives need to make and need to capitalize on. And that's what Langdon did in the Tim Hardaway Jr. trade. So I very much liked that. I very much think it set the tone for how he was going to operate this offseason. And in a vacuum, is it some home run, franchise altering move? No, but it gave us an indication of how Langdon was going to proceed. And it showed that this current executive team seems better equipped than the one before it to build a functional NBA roster.
Yeah, I think setting the tone was really the thing that you hit on. That to me was the most important. It's not flashy, it's not sexy to get Tim Hardaway Jr. There's a reason that the Mavs were so excited to get rid of him. It's because he was out of the playoff rotation, but he fits exactly what the Pistons are looking for. He fits as a guy who is able to bring in shooting. He fits as a guy who's a veteran in a group of very young players, and he fits as a guy who comes with some second-round draft picks because you're willing to take on his salary. And to me, that's worth something. It's worth using your cap space in a meaningful way, in a way that the Pistons hadn't in years past. So I totally agree on Tim Hardaway. Is he going to let the world on fire? No. He might win a game or two for you on some random January or February game because he is that kind of guy. But it's not going to set the world on fire, but it does set the tone for what the Pistons are trying to do. My pick for favorite move. Oh yeah.
Go ahead. Real quick there might even be spurts where he's not even a part of the rotation. So you might look back at this and say,
correct.
You're saying your favorite move of the offseason was to go out and get a guy that isn't even in Detroit's rotation every single night. And I'll say yes, because it just goes back to the Langdon starting to lay the foundation of an identity for how he wants to build this team, right, while also adding assets to Detroit's cupboard there. So, yeah, even if Hardaway goes through a cold streak and finds himself out of the rotation for a few games, which is probably going to happen. He's just that kind of player where he has some months where he is lights out 50% from the three-point line, is going to get you 15 to 18 points a game. There will be those months where he just isn't hitting shots, and it makes him very hard to play. And on this Detroit team that seemingly has a little bit of a deeper roster and a greater collection of wings than they've had in years past, there could be some games where he sits out. But overall, the move, the idea of what Tim Hardaway brings and what else that move brought was encouraging to me right away as soon as Langdon stepped in.
Yeah, he might not be in the rotation, and that's just going to kind of happen. In fact, if he's not in the rotation, that means there are other players playing better than him, and hopefully those are guys like Jaden Ivey and Asar Thompson. So yes, it is kind of an odd move to say it's my favorite because he was the guy that wasn't in a playoff rotation just a few months ago at this point, but it is a good tone-setting move. And by the way, we were kind of expecting Troy Weaver to do these types of moves for like years now, and it just never happened, and now it is happening. So it's a step in the right direction, as sad as that may seem to some people who are just kind of looking at Tim Hardaway and thinking, oh my goodness, this isn't going to move the needle. This isn't going to make the Pistons a playoff team, but it is going to make the Pistons a competent team. And that was the goal of the offseason. And kind of in that same vein is Tobias Harris, which was my pick for move of the offseason, not just because he is a competent wing who can shoot the basketball, but because his contract is only for 2 years. And there were early inklings of, oh, he's going to get a max. The Pistons are going to throw everything they have at him. They didn't. They signed him for 2 years. They align him with a point in which the offseason for 2 years down the road is going to potentially get expensive with more extensions coming down. But they gave themselves some wiggle room by not having him be making like Zach LaVine-esque salary numbers that deep into a point where the Pistons ideally are going to be looking to add playoff level talent to make a playoff run. Ideally, they're going to win 25 games next year, maybe 32 games the year after. Then you're looking at a team that needs to make some moves in the offseason to try to make the playoffs and go deep. And by only signing Tobias Harris to a 2-year deal, it gives them that flexibility to do it easier. So it's smart. It solves both a current and a future problem. You bring in a guy who can shoot. You bring in a guy who can handle the basketball, who takes some pressure off of Cade Cunningham, a guy who can hit threes. A lot of Sixers fans were sort of clowning Pistons fans for being happy about getting Tobias Harris because they just wanted to get rid of him and they couldn't stand him. The Sixers and the Pistons are not in the same position organizationally. The Pistons needed adults in the room. The Sixers were looking for guys who can contribute to a playoff run and potentially a championship run. Those are two very different measuring sticks. And the Pistons made a smart move in getting a guy like Tobias Harris, who's familiar with the organization, who's clearly excited to be coming back here, not just him coming back, but his family coming back as well. So to me, that was my favorite move, not just because you get a guy who immediately raises the floor, but you give yourself the financial flexibility down the line to be able to make another move when you're looking to take a real meaningful step up to being like a more than just a playoff team, like make it to the second or third round of the playoff.
I like that pick a lot. For all of the chagrin that the Tobias Harris gets, this is a guy that last year still averaged over 17 points a game, 6.5 rebounds, over 3 assists per game, shot over 35% from the 3-point line, which is somewhat of a down year from him in that regard because he's a career 37, 38% 3-point shooter. This signing made all the sense in the world for Detroit, and it just kind of continued on the trend of what Langdon set out to do with the trade for Tim Hardaway Jr., bringing in those veterans that fit with your core, can space the floor, can give you good minutes, are going to teach the young players how to be NBA players, how to conduct themselves on a daily basis. And Harris gives all of that. And he's been very, very vocal in his excitement to be here and his excitement to be part of turning this thing around in Detroit. It was, there were a lot of fans that were very upset when the Blake Griffin trade happened and Tobias Harris was traded away from Detroit. That was probably, the biggest issue people had with the trade was that they were giving up Tobias Harris, who had been so good in Detroit. And so now he's back and gives Detroit an immediate boost at the forward spot, will immediately come in and start on this team and give them everything that they need. Kind of playing, that Jeremy Grant role from a few years ago. He doesn't need to do what Jeremy Grant did really in like his last year, where it was all Jeremy Grant on the ball, him trying to do everything. But when he was, spotting up and hitting threes, giving them some rebounding help, giving them some, extra playmaking a little bit here and there, like all those things, being able to play defense. Like Tobias Harris isn't a lockdown guy on that end of the floor, but he can certainly hold his own and is going to help them there for a team that was so bad defensively last year. So I agree with that. I think it was a great signing. And, if I had to pick Tim Hardaway Jr. as my move of the offseason, Tobias Harris would have definitely been my next choice.
Yeah, and, there are other good moves that the Pistons had, which is pretty rare considering the last couple off seasons they've had. We're not really used to this. This time last year, we were talking about Joe Harris. So this is definitely a step in the right direction. But they did have some maybe more puzzling moves. It's way too early to say anything is a bad move because players haven't played yet. But what was your least favorite move of the offseason? Maybe the one that had you at least questioning the decision-making a little bit. Again, it's too early to say if it was bad or good. And especially with the ones that we picked, it's way too early if it's bad or good. But, which decisions had you sort of questioning the line of thinking from the front office?
Well, for me, I'm going to go with something that hasn't happened, at least not yet. And that's the Pistons not going out and signing a veteran point guard, a guy like Kyle Lowry, a guy like Reggie Jackson, who's someone that has the experience of a point guard and can come in and give you minutes. Maybe if he's not even in the rotation every night, but just having another point guard on the roster. I look at the guard group right now, and obviously Cade's there. Obviously Cade's the starting one. You could see Jaden Ivey getting some minutes at the one as well. And then it's like, what do they have? They have Marcus Sasser. In theory, he's really not a one despite being all of 6 foot. He's kind of that off-ball floor spacing two. You don't really want him out there running the show. And if the Pistons are going to stagger Cunningham and Ivey, maybe the plan is for those two to take up all 48 minutes at the point guard spot when it's all said and done. But we also know injuries are a thing. We also know Cade has missed time every year that he's been in the league. So it feels like they've needed some more depth there. And that's why I really wanted them to go out and get someone like Tyus Jones, who just signed an absolute bargain deal with the Phoenix Suns. And, people will say, hey, he signed with the Phoenix Suns. They're going to contend. Like, he probably didn't want to play for a bad team. Well, he just signed a deal with the year before that with the Washington Wizards. So he's very comfortable playing for whoever was going to pay him. And the Pistons could have paid him more than what Phoenix did. So I think for me, I don't have a ton of dislike in this offseason for the Pistons. I've actually liked a lot of what they've done. I can see the logic in every move that's been made. But I think them not making a move for a backup point guard will come back to bite them if they don't end up doing it still. And like we've said, there's still plenty of time. We know Detroit could end up being involved as a third team in a trade with one of these stars that could get moved, or these bigger contracts that could get moved. So they could be holding out until, towards the start of the season to see if one of those deals is going to materialize before bringing in a third guard. But they're starting to fall off the board. I mean, Killian Hayes got signed, so you can't get him back. You can't get your guy back. But it just feels like they need some help there. And if they don't end up doing something, that I think will be a mistake.
Yeah, and there is still time. Lauri Markkanen rumors continue to, trickle in very slowly. I'm sure the Olympics are going to keep that slow. But it's weird. The Jazz, for the second time in like 3 years, are going to end up making a September trade that alters the landscape of the league, if they move Markkanen to Golden State or whoever. But that could open the floodgates for a bunch of other transaction as a result of that. So this could all be very different in the next couple of weeks. And you're right, there wasn't really one move I could point to and think that was really bad. Even the Joe Harris move last year, we were like, he can't really move that much. He's kind of like a zombie out there, but we weren't even going to call it terrible right out of the gate. He did have a history of being able to shoot the basketball. Yeah, little did we know that he wasn't even an NBA caliber player, period. But my least favorite move, and again, huge caveat, because he hasn't played yet other than some summer league ball, is Ron Holland at 5th overall. And that's the key point, is at 5th overall. Because I think the Pistons could have traded down and still been able to draft him later at like 9 or 10, if not later after that. His stock was falling pretty heavily. It was continuing to fall. There was a lot of talk about how Matas Buzelis was going to go ahead of him, and that was going to be kind of the inflection point where the two would go. But I think at 5 it was a little bit of a reach, and I'm of the mindset that if you have a guy that you like, you go out and get him, even if that means reaching. If you really believe in your research and your homework, then go out and get him, and that's fine. But I think they could have gotten him later than 5. Again, has nothing to do with Ron Holland as a player. The Pistons certainly needed wings. They did need wings who could shoot, and he doesn't have that capability yet. Doesn't mean he won't ever develop it. But I think at 5, it was a little bit early of a reach, and based on our notes, I think you would agree with that.
No, Mike, you're spot on. And I was going to talk about Ron Holland here, but wanted to let you hit on him because I know that was someone you wanted to talk on. So Ron Holland would have been my pick here, just like Tobias Harris could have been my pick for our favorite move of the offseason. Look, I wrote about why the Pistons should have stayed away from Ron Holland before the draft.
That's very true.
It isn't clear here. The group of wings that they already have, the group of, twos and threes that need minutes, the guys on this roster, specifically the young core players that, already need to develop into good shooters and aren't good shooters currently. There's a number of them. And Ron Holland now kind of just gets added to that group. Now, what I will say, now that most of the offseason has passed, is I think that Langdon's done a really good job adding what Detroit needed in terms of spacing and help for Cade Cunningham, that Ron Holland looks a lot better after the draft, after free agency, than he did right when he got picked at 5 or during the pre-draft process, because I think the roster overall is just better suited for Cunningham and the rest of the core. And it's Holland's not going to be this guy playing 30 minutes a night right away anyway. So it's going to allow him to come in slower, play in smaller doses and blowouts later in games, maybe in the G League a little bit here and there. Like, there are enough guys that fit in the starting group where you didn't have to draft a guy at 5 that could immediately give you 30 minutes in the starting lineup alongside Cade Cunningham. But at the same time, like you said, this is probably a guy that you could have drafted at 9, 10, or there were rumors he was going to fall out of the lottery. So you could have traded back Erie and still gotten him. And we're kind of splitting hairs here at this point, because we both said it, really not a move that we hate in this offseason. It's hard to really say anything is terrible when we haven't seen it play out yet, especially with the idea that we're kind of giving Langdon the benefit of the doubt since it's his first year here and he's starting to put things in place. But on paper, Holland maybe was a bit of a reach at 5, and I think that's not just us saying that. There are other people on an executive level in the NBA that feel that way too. So it's not just us, trying to cause a stir or whatever for ratings or for eyes or anything like that. Like, I said it before the draft, before they drafted him, that this was a guy that I wouldn't have on my at the top of my big board if I was Detroit. Things change now with how the rest of the offseason went, but if I had to pick a move, outside of them not going out and getting a point guard, Ron Holland would be that for me.
Yeah, and again, I can't fault the organization that is devoid of wing talent by taking a chance on a very young, high upside wing who was a very highly rated prospect. I can't fault an organization for doing that, especially when you go out and get a coach like Fred Vinson, a shooting coach with his repertoire and notoriety around the league, to come in and help a lot of the non-shooters on this roster right now. So I can't fault the Pistons for trying it and taking a swing. We could have faulted them on taking, a low ceiling type of guy, but I think the ceiling for Ron Holland is quite high compared to some of the other players that probably would have been there around 8 to 15.
Absolutely. That's what makes the Holland selection okay, is because you did enough in the offseason to get guys that can give you minutes right now. Holland is the guy that has that high upside out of a draft class that maybe has a bunch of guys that don't have a ton of great upside long term. Holland probably has arguably the highest upside out of anyone in this draft class. So if you want to take the swing and you knew at that moment in the draft kind of what you wanted to do with the rest of your offseason, how you were going to approach it, who you were targeting, like, it looks okay now. And so that's where, again, we're just kind of we're splitting hairs at that point, trying to find something wrong with an offseason. Yeah. Really hasn't been all that wrong in general. Right.
And there were some executives who questioned the decision, and it appears that executives have a lot of thoughts on the Pistons. Our final topic will be about a quote from an NBA executive that was collected by you, Aaron, through Jonathan Gavoni and Jeremy Wu from ESPN. I lost my brain for just like 5 seconds. And it was a quote about
me 5 times a day, if not more.
This is a quote from ESPN regarding Cade Cunningham from an anonymous executive. They feel bad for Cade Cunningham, or actually I'll do the quote, and I quote, "I feel bad for Cade Cunningham. They've been rebuilding for years, even though they never planned on it, and this pick signals they might need to blow up the roster and start over again. I just don't see how Holland plays with Asar Thompson, Jaden Ivey, and all the other young guys. That situation is a mess. Even when Holland was scoring in Vegas. It was ugly to watch. So there's many different levels to that quote from an anonymous NBA executive taking shots at multiple players. But I think the thing that stands out is I feel bad for Cade Cunningham. By the way, I don't really feel bad for Cade Cunningham. He signed a rookie max extension. He's getting paid a lot of money to quote unquote deal with playing with these younger players that may not work to his skill set that well. But what is your take on this quote? This sort of just shots fired out of nowhere for an organization that has had plenty of shots thrown their way. Now we get another one after they not only draft a very high upside wing at 5, but they keep Cade Cunningham after all these rumors and thoughts of, maybe he'll turn down the rookie max, yet he takes the rookie max and is staying with the organization.
Yeah, I'd feel a lot worse for Cade Cunningham if someone like Troy Weaver was still the top executive and was spending the offseason, bringing in Monte Morris and Joe Harris and calling it an offseason. That's not the case anymore. And, I feel like we're repeating ourselves over and over again, but it's been a very productive offseason for Langdon and the Pistons this time around. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like this isn't the same Detroit Pistons franchise that it's been for the last decade plus. Like, it feels like finally maybe things are starting to change. Maybe they're finally starting to correct course. And it's not going to translate into 40 wins this year. It's not going to translate into, a 6 seed playoff team this year, but it's going to translate into them not making history for the longest losing streak in franchise history and the worst record in NBA history. Like, they're going to start to just be an averagely bad team, and then hopefully under this leadership get better and better year in and year out. And I mean, gosh, we talked about it a little bit last week when we talked about do we expect the Pistons to go over their current win total line of 24.5, and we said over. Like, I think there's a world where maybe they do sneak into the play-in as like a 9 or 10 seed and get enough wins if everything breaks right for them. So it's like that tells you there's signs of progress, there's signs of growth. Like, that was not the case last year when their line opened up at, I think, 29.5, fell all the way to 27.5. Like, we weren't talking about them being able to sneak into the play-in or anything like that. That wasn't the case for them. This year, again, I don't think it's likely, but they're going to be better. They're finally going to start moving in the right direction. And so for this quote to come out now after the offseason the Pistons have had, the quote kind of sounds like me right after Ron Holland's name was called on draft night, but so much has happened since then to where the Pistons have actually gone out and improved the roster for next season that quote just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, at least that specific part, because I maybe do agree on that last part about Ron Holland scoring in Vegas didn't look pretty, but I don't want to get into that right now because I know people will get very emotional about talking bad about a new player, so I don't want to go down that road. But yeah, I just think that quote's a little rich right now because it finally, for the first time, from us who, I wouldn't say are the most optimistic Pistons people out there in the community, but it finally starts to feel like things are going a little bit in the right direction. So this quote feels a little bit off in terms of timing.
Yeah, I think we have the reputation of maybe being too pessimistic. Like, we were the first ones on Troy Weaver being like, what is this guy doing? Does anybody not see what's happening? He gets a secret extension and makes all these weird moves. But anyway, it just seems mean-spirited. Like, yeah, there are fit concerns, and you watched a lot of Summer League just like I did, and Ron Holland did not look particularly good shooting the basketball, but there's a lot of players who did look good shooting the basketball that won't sniff an NBA roster this season. As a, Cleveland Cavaliers local fan, if you would have asked anybody last offseason, they would have told you Imani Bates was going to be the starting 3 by the end of the season. And guess what? That didn't happen. And not only that, he's still not an NBA caliber player, despite doing some fun stuff in Summer League. So Summer League is like a litmus test almost of, how much you're influenced by some rookies playing against other rookies and other journeymen. If your guy's not dominating, it's like, uh-oh. But if he is dominating, it's like, okay, everyone take a step back. He's playing against, Luke Travers, who's been in Australia for 3 years. And, let's just be aware of that.
I've been meaning to ask you that because I did see a lot of like Amani Bates on like the NBA Twitter channel, like getting highlights and stuff. He's not an NBA player yet.
No. Jalen Tyson looked a lot better. I'm in the camp that Jalen Tyson could be the starting 3 by the end of the year, way more so than Imani Bates. Bates is just a shot chucker. He still gets just absolutely crushed when he's defending screens. He has a long way to go. That doesn't mean he can't turn into a good player. He's obviously got limitless range, but it's like, let's temper expectations. You still have Max Strus ahead of him. You still have guys like Dean Wade who are NBA caliber players and super tall that, are going to be in the pecking order. Let's calm down. But
next year, you don't think?
No, I think he's back in the G League.
Okay.
For sure.
Sorry to take us off track. I was just curious. And I know
No, but
we'll know the name Amani Bates because he tore up the Michigan high school basketball scene for quite some time.
Right.
Was supposed to be the next Kevin Durant. He was one of those next Kevin Durants that we hear about every 2-3 years. But who's the next one? Is it Cooper Flag that's next? No, I feel like that we just saw someone else get compared to Kevin Durant. But Amani was one that everyone that's listening would know if you're local listening to this podcast because he was a huge name in Michigan for a few years.
Yeah, he was a top recruit. And look, I watched him play against Kent State when he made his move to Eastern Michigan. I'm a Kent State alum, and I watched quite a bit of Imani Bates, and a guy that could win you a game on any given night or go, 1 for 19 from the floor and lose you a game within the first 10 minutes. But no, he's probably not an NBA player quite yet. Ron Holland's way, way ahead of him in terms of being an NBA ready player. I mean, light years ahead, even with the bad scoring, the athleticism, the desire to play well on defense. He's got all those things, and that's stuff you can't really teach. You can improve a jump shot over time, and the Pistons have a coach who can make that happen. But this quote just seems mean-spirited, like they weren't paying a whole lot of attention to the offseason. There are other players on the team that fit well with Cade Cunningham. I don't think Ron Holland is going to, see a whole lot of playing time necessarily. I mean, I don't know about you. He's very raw from the summer league. So, to say that, Cade Cunningham, you feel bad for him because the Pistons drafted a guy who's more of a project, and Asar Thompson and Jaden Ivey are like not ready to be stars yet. I don't think anybody's thinking that they're going to be stars immediately, but to blow up the roster, just to say blow up the roster, feel bad for Cade just seems like you haven't been really paying attention to what the Pistons are trying to do this offseason.
Agreed. It's not like the Pistons have been picking at 1 in these star-studded drafts ever since getting Cade. Like they've picked at 5 3 years in a row. If you want to say you feel bad for Cade from the standpoint that the Pistons kept falling out of the top 1, 2, 3 spots in the lottery every year since he's been a Piston, that would be different. That I'd agree with you for. But no, I think it's a quote that, it feels a little outdated after the offseason that the Pistons have had. Not that I don't agree if you were just saying, like, maybe they haven't done a great job putting core guys around Cade Cunningham that make a whole lot of sense, like if you're talking about Asar Thompson and Ron Holland. But you can only do so much, and it feels like both Thompson and Holland and Ivy are all upside swings. And when you're drafting top 5, you're usually drafting for the highest potential, for the best player available. And that's arguably what all 3 of those guys were in terms of upside when they were drafted on draft night.
And it's all hindsight 2020. What was the conversation after they drafted Jaden Ivey, pairing him with Cade Cunningham? We were ecstatic in our chat. I don't think the national, spotlight was like, what are the Pistons doing? They just drafted a guy who can't play next to Cade. No one was saying that.
Everyone was saying it's the backcourt of the future. And I'll still say that that's the backcourt of the future. I wrote about it for PalaceofPistons.com on Wednesday. I wrote about my starting lineup for the Pistons heading into next season and what I would have it be. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read it yet, which, I mean, get your head out of the gutter and get to PalaceofPistons.com and go read it. But my starting backcourt was Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey. You're going to have to go to PalaceofPistons.com to get the full reasoning. But, like, I still think there's a future there with those two. It's just about learning how to maximize both, and hopefully that's what this organization is doing with the floor spacing and the veterans that they've brought in this year at the forward spots, and with the addition of JB Bickerstaff, who's worked in a two-guard system with Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell and found ways to get both of them reps on ball and build rotations where both of them have the opportunity to be the top guy out there. Like, it makes sense. So don't want to devolve off of the path we're on, but just wanted to call that out there as well. Mike, we might just need a solo pod of you, like, talking about how JB Bickerstaff utilized Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, because hell, I'd sit and listen to that. I need to find something like that, because I very much hope the plan is for both of them to start. And I feel like some quotes from Bickerstaff make it sound like that's the plan, but I also think there's some stuff that goes around that makes it seem like Ivy's going to come off the bench, and maybe someone like Malik Beasley starts at the 2 spot. I'm really hoping that for a team that doesn't look like it's going to be a playoff team next season, unless absolutely everything in the world goes right and then some, I really hope that they give this backcourt that they drafted, despite it being a different leadership group that drafted it, I really hope that they give them one final chance under a legitimate NBA coach to figure out if they work together.
And even before, Donovan Mitchell was a player that is a lot closer to Jaden Ivey's sort of skill set currently, and that's Colin Sexton. Whether people want to believe it or not, if you pull up side-by-side stats for their first 2 seasons, Colin Sexton's beating out Jaden Ivey in a lot of areas. And that's not something that you like to see, but it's a very similar situation of trying to run a 2-guard system. Colin Sexton's not a point guard. They used him as a shooting guard. He always fit better as that. He fit better as a 6th man. I think Jaden Ivey's a lot more skilled, definitely as a passer, than Colin Sexton, but Bickerstaff had to navigate that as well. That's a much more apt comparison to me at this stage.
I really, really hope JB Bickerstaff can figure out Jaden Ivey and can get him back on track, because boy, did Monty Williams ruin what looked like was going to be such a good player, an all-star level player after his first season in the league. Man, for all the faults that Dwayne Casey had, it almost feels like the Pistons would be in a better spot had they just kept him. And he had his own issues, no doubt. We were all ready for him to go. He just kind of run his course, kind of like he did in Toronto before that. But the damage that Monty Williams did in one season with the organization, it is beyond words how much.
It's immeasurable still. It's immeasurable. If Jaden Ivey can't be rectified.
If they can't get him fixed after the rookie season that he had, man, that is a huge loss.
It's a huge loss. And I think it's part of the reason that the Pistons are not willing to just trade him for anything. They want to see it work. Or at least they want to see it at least brought to a point where they can make a decision on the backcourt. And they haven't been able to do that for myriad reasons, whether that be injuries or inept coaching. This season, I feel like you have a guy that has experience with running essentially 2-point guards in the backcourt, splitting time, staggering them. This is the opportunity. Maybe at the deadline, if you don't see it and an offer becomes available, you can pull the trigger before you have to start to think about Jaden Ivey's future contractually. But yeah, I would do a solo pod to talk about the 2 guards. That was a painful time because the Cavs actually got better when Colin Sexton was out with an injury and they went back to Ricky Rubio. But I would be down to do a solo pod if fans are interested in hearing about the JB Bickerstaff 2-guard experience.
Well, I know I want to hear it. So hopefully people will tell us in the comments that they want that, because I'd love to just, it can be a bonus episode. We don't have to lose the weekly show that we do, but I'd love to just find on my podcast feed one day that you did a solo podcast on it, and I can just throw that on and start watching some highlights of Cunningham and Ivey together, go back and maybe watch some of Mitchell and Garland and see how they can replicate what those two did. So I hope that people tell us they want that. That would be good. And I'm sorry.
Yes, definitely. Let us know.
Getting us off track.
No. You're fine.
So
we didn't have a whole lot of topics, so we kind of needed to fill some space. And I think we filled an adequate amount of space. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we end this sort of truncated episode of the Palace of Pistons podcast?
Well, I guess I'll just reiterate one more time. Wrote about my ideal starting lineup for the Detroit Pistons on opening night. I know it's not going to be the one that everyone wants. I know there are going to be people that are upset with who I have in and who I have out. Go read it on palaceofpistons.com. Tell me what you think, whether you come back to the YouTube comment section or you comment on Substack. I want to know what your lineup would be, what's wrong with mine, what's good with mine. I've actually got some pretty solid reaction to it so far. I thought I was going to get a lot of like, what the hell is this? Actually hasn't been that bad. So very curious what the always very thoughtful podcast listeners have to say. You guys have a lot of spirits in how you talk about the Pistons and how you talk about the show. So I always want to hear what you guys have to say.
You want to give our plugs, Aaron? End of show plugs?
Absolutely, I do, Mike. As always, make sure to check out palaceofpistons.com. But you can also get us on all of our socials, TikTok, X, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you're watching or listening from. Please take 30 seconds. Hit the subscribe or follow button. If you can leave a star review, or if you can leave, and when I say a star review, I mean a 5-star review, not no 3, not no 2. I need a 5-star review, especially on Spotify. So we're at like a 3.7 on Spotify. Where are the Spotify listeners at? Come on, guys, you got to represent us a little bit better than that. I think we're at least a 4.2, not a 3.7. On YouTube, hit the like button. Again, leave us a comment. We want to know what you think. If you got some topics for us to talk about, since we're in the dog days of the offseason, let us know what you want to hear us talk about. Like, we've got the shows to do it. So give us some good options. Give us some good ideas. We will riff for 10, 15, 20 minutes on any topic. So, we're going to have stuff no matter what each week. But if you've got some ideas that maybe we haven't thought of, we'd love to hear them. But go subscribe, go follow, go like. All that stuff greatly, greatly helps us. We really appreciate it. And we need to continue to grow in order to continue to do what we're doing each week. So thank you so much for your continued support. Love you guys, and looking forward to next week's show because we're going to have some more great stuff to talk about.
Yes, we'll figure out what great stuff we're going to talk about, whether it's just letting Jasper talk about anything that comes into his head, and we could just comment on it. I'm sure that would probably go over well in the comments, but we are making our way through the dog days of summer. It'll be training camp before you know it. It'll be football season before you know it, and it'll be us drafting our fantasy football league for the 4th year in a row.
I got one thing that I want to say, because we brought up Troy Weaver a few times this week, a few times this week on this show.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, after the MLB trade deadline has concluded, I have officially come to the realization that Detroit Tigers GM Scott Harris, or president of baseball ops, whatever his title is, he is just the Tigers version of Troy Weaver.
Ooh.
Oh my gosh, what a disastrous trade deadline for the Tigers. A lot of sitting on your hands, a lot of not doing what you need to do, and then you get beat on a move in which Scott Harris did, where he reportedly over-asked from the Dodgers and ended up having to take an offer less than what was originally on the table from Los Angeles. Oh, man. It's scary that the Lions are the organization in the city right now that have it the most figured out. But it just feels like the Red Wings, the Tigers, and the Pistons, and then the Lions before that with Bob Quinn. They just had executives not aggressive enough. I will put it that way. They didn't get aggressive enough in trying to build competitive teams. So that's my baseball talk for maybe the year. But just wanted to get that out there.
I was really hoping that Jack Flaherty would just walk across the diamond to the Guardians dugout, and we could call it at that. I know that the Guards would have given up an infield prospect or two, since they have about 10 billion of them. But in defense of the Tigers, it was a very weird market for starting pitchers after the Astros gave up a haul for Yusei Kikuchi. But this is not the Believe in Tigers podcast. This is the Palace of Pistons podcast. So before we get into more baseball talk, because we really could riff on sports for the next like 2 hours, probably, if we really wanted to. I wanted to wrap up our show. We will have a lot more to talk about next week. Hopefully, we'll have Jasper back as well. And like Aaron said, if you have not subscribed to our Substack already, please do that. If you haven't given us a like on YouTube, if you haven't given us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, please do that. It means the world to us so we can keep making this awesome content for you. For my co-host, Aaron Johnson, I am Mike Anguilano. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's edition of the Palace of Pistons Podcast, part of the Believe Network. We will see you all next time.